The skipper left Venezuela in early December loaded with heavy oil, a denser type, difficult to refine, but valuable in large volumes, with internal records pointing to Cuba as a destination, more specifically the port of Matanzas. But in practice, the trip was designed to do two things at the same time: send the minimum oil needed to Cuba, and with the bulk of the load, go to Asia, with strong indications that its destination was China. 2 days after disarming, the skipper made a small ship-to-ship transfer at high tide, with about 50,000 barrels being moved to another ship, the Neptune 6, which then headed north towards Cuba. The American skipper's apprehension operation took place in international waters between Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago, with air approach and control of the ship. An action that, according to judicial documents, was supported by the federal mandate issued by the American justice, with the basis of sanctions imposed in 2022. But why does Cuba appear at the center of all this history? Venezuela and Cuba have a decades-long relationship based on geopolitical strife, with Caracas sending oil in extremely favorable conditions, and with Havana paying with services, like doctors, and more recently, even with the military. According to sources close to the Pentagon, Maduro's dictatorship began to depend more on protection and against Cuban intelligence, including for the personal safety of the dictator and important figures of the regime. And why does this matter so much in the military tabloid set up in the Caribbean? This matters because when the security of dictatorial regimes comes into play, oil ceases to be just a commodity and becomes an infrastructure of political survival of regimes. But curiously, in recent years, only a fraction of the oil separated for Cuba really arrived on the island, with oil crimmed for Cuba being many times resold to China. But even when the oil doesn't arrive, the money from the resale, yes, arrives in Havana. It's a kind of big state money laundering scheme, with Cuba receiving only the minimum oil needed to keep it running, with the rest going to China, which in turn resells it in the international market, passing the money back to the Cuban regime. For Venezuela, keeping Cuba running, whether with oil or with living money, helps to keep the security gear and political support working. And precisely for this reason, Cuba was one of the countries that most condemned the skipper's arrest, accusing the United States of piracy. And there is an important operational detail. The skipper transported oil hired by Cuba Metales, a Cuban state oil trade company, and for a trading linked to other intermediaries, including Panama. According to the American investigation, Cuba Metales would have closed contracts to buy about 65,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan oil per year, a considerable increase compared to the purchase rate of previous years. Besides, it is important to remember that Cuba Metales has already been sanctioned by the American Treasury in the context of restrictions on the Venezuelan oil sector. This apprehension also acts in the context of the psychological war, because when the United States shows that they can take control of an oil company in international waters without shooting, without casualties, and with legal protection prepared, they spread panic among the dictatorships depend on this oil to survive and to continue working as a regime. There is also another small curious detail about the crew that draws attention. There were about 30 sailors, mostly Russian. But at the end of all this gear, the main part is just one: China, which is the big market capable of absorbing volumes and sustain this trade under pressure, used to maintain failed regimes, as is the case of Iran and Cuba. This action raises an inevitable question. Will the United States impose a naval blockade on Venezuela, aiming to also affect other hostile regimes? A naval blockade, in the classic sense of the right of armed conflicts at sea, is typically a war act and involves declaring and notifying, delimiting the area, applying effectively, and respecting humanitarian and proportionate requirements as systematized by the San Remo Manual. But what we saw in the case of the skipper seems closer to the extraterritorial application of sanctions than a formal naval blockade. However, if the gunners, security guards, and crews conclude that the route has become a trap, the route dries up, resulting in an economic blockade in fact, but not declared. And even without formally declaring a blockade, the United States expanded its presence and patrols, making the Caribbean a constant area of inspection over suspicious ships. When a helicopter flies over an oil tanker in the Caribbean and agents come down in the converse with an arrest warrant in hand, The message is not only for the captain of the ship, it is for the financial intermediaries, the logistics operators, the regimes that receive the oil, and those who have this money to keep regimes standing. And in the center of all this is a question that will guide the next few months. How far will Washington turn sanctions into effective action at sea? And what will be the reaction of the Chinese government, the main intermediary and financier of this international scheme to support dictatorships? And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any news.